Welcome, everybody that's here so far. Thank you very much for turning up to the first of the JNCC's Natural Capital Seminar Series. This is part of wider CPD training for the JNCC, and it also aligns with our overall strategy, where we'll talk about how we understand how biodiversity relates to other aspects of the natural environment and how it underpins the ecosystem services that benefit society and the economy. So even if you don't directly work in natural capital, I hope you will find this useful and interesting. This is the first of the series. We're also going to cover terrestrial natural capital, as well as some financial and economic perspectives, as well as showcase some ongoing natural capital work that's happening here at the JNCC. We will be recording this talk, so please can you keep your cameras and microphones off whilst the talks are taking place. And also, if you could avoid using the chat function on Teams whilst people are speaking, as this is because the notifications can be distracting. Instead, we're going to be using Slido, where you can ask your own questions and upvote ones that you'd like to have answered. So I'll post that link in the chat again for anyone that's just joined. Oh, Poppy's done it, thank you. Each talk is going to be about 20 minutes long, and then we'll have time for questions and a discussion at the end after both of our speakers have presented. If you're having any technical issues today, please message either myself or Poppy Cooney, and we'll do our best to help. For today, we are joined by Hannah Fennel and Dr. Stephen Watson. Hannah is head of the Orkney Fisheries Association and a doctoral candidate at Heriot-Watt University. And Dr. Stephen Watson is an interdisciplinary ecosystem services scientist at the Plymouth Marine Lab. I'll hand over to Stephen now as our first speaker, but I hope you enjoy. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks, Louise. I'll just share my slides. You can all see them. If not, just shout. So I'm going to be presenting today on a project which finished a few years ago now, called the Solent Natural Capital Project. It was a collaboration between the University of Portsmouth, PML, which I'm now based as an ecosystem service researcher, and the Environment Agency. We had the kind of subtitle of looking at how habitat extent and condition could be integrated into nature-based solution assessments. And the project looked at the Solent marine sites, which is the blue area. So this is our case study area. It's a European marine site. It's designated for several different important habitats and species, which makes it an ideal place to look at a natural capital assessment. It stretches from Lymington Harbour in the west over to Pagham Harbour in the east. It also has a bit in the middle, which is a kind of open water area called the Solent Strait. And it has 4 estuaries along the top of the Isle of Wight, from the Yar estuary over to Bembridge Harbour. And you can just about see from the graph that there's little lines that designate the boundaries of where we looked at in each estuary. And these are roughly based on WFD assessment area criteria. But the main focus of the project was around water quality. The Solent has huge problems around excess nitrogen and phosphorus enrichment, which is causing eutrophication of various protected habitats and species. As you can see from the pie chart on the right-hand side, around 50% of nutrients coming to the Solent are based from agriculture, 10% are from urban developments, and around 40% comes from coastal background. And it's kind of got to the point now in the Solent where new development can't continue because algal mats are basically just covering everything. So now new development must show that they can reduce their nutrient inputs into the harbour before new development can go ahead. So this is where our project came in. We were asked if we could firstly map the extent of various different habitats in the Solent. We then wanted to address or assess the capacity of these habitats to remove nitrogen, phosphorus, and also carbon. And then we wanted to put this in an economic context to see what the regulatory benefits might be of these habitats, because it's rarely actually valued. The project was around 18 months. It's all published now. If you're interested, there is a final report, so please do check this out. We also had a fourth objective, which we got onto a bit later in the project, where we looked at how habitat condition might affect some of these different processes. And the Solent's also home to various different nature-based solutions. So we did some scenario analysis around how the different services might change if we were to implement some of these solutions. So this is the kind of running order of my talk today. Back one. So we're talking about natural capital today. So this is how the aims fit into a natural capital type approach. Firstly, we did some ecosystem mapping. We collected the best available evidence for the various extent of habitats in the solent. We then assessed these in an ecosystem service context. So nitrogen and phosphorus can be linked to the service of waste remediation, whereas carbon could be linked to the service of climate regulation. And then we use various abatement costs and replacement costs economic values to assess the benefits. So this is how it fits into a generalized natural capital framework. So our first objective, we created a natural capital baseline map. We looked at 7 key habitats that we thought were important, including reed beds, salt marsh, seagrass, littoral sediments. We separated out algal mats on top of littoral sediments, subtidal sediments, and we also looked at native oyster beds because of their importance in the solent. We got our data from various sources. We used the JNCC CMAP, EMODNet seabed habitat maps. We got oyster bed data from the IFCA, Southern IFCA. We got macroalgal data from the Environment Agency. The Dorset Wildlife Trust helped us out with some salt marsh and reed bed data. So we combined all this into a finalized kind of map. So this is our best evidence that we had at the time, and it can be updated as new data comes available. We also assign a confidence. So how confident were we in the GIS data? This is based on a JNCC framework that scores our confidence between 1 and 4. How good is the remote sensing data? Can we see the class boundaries? Are they distinct? And has anyone ground truthed them? What is the sampling regime like? And we found there was a great deal of variation in the solent. Macroalgal data was really good because it's been ground truthed, whereas things like seagrass beds were really poor. The class boundaries were really indistinct and patchy. So it just highlights that there is still some work to do in mapping different habitats in the solent area. We then went on to the ecosystem services. We did a light touch overview. So we searched the literature for how different temperate habitat would take up nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. We then looked at how these various habitats could remove it in terms of a mean, median, min, and max. So we took a range of estimates for how much nutrients these habitats could take up to give some kind of degree of variation around the service. We also, when we did this review, we came up with a bit of a data gap that native oysters hadn't been studied. So we had to use the Eastern Eastern American oyster as a proxy. So this is just another kind of data gap that we identified that needs filled. In a summary, this is what we found. We looked at how much burial of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon of the 7 different habitats, how much of these elements go into the actual sediments. For nitrogen, we looked at denitrification, so how much nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere. And in the case of the oysters, we also looked at how much of these nutrients can be stored in the shell, because there's various ways that these processes can contribute towards the final service. We then broke this down at a kind of regional scale, so that the graphs on the left show across the whole of the solent, and you can see there's quite a range of variation, but generally the subtidal and littoral sediments were the greatest contributors towards nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon actually, whereas salt marsh, seagrass, and reed beds actually contributed a smaller proportion. But if you look at the graph on the right, if you looked at a catchment basis, these habitats were actually really important. So it depends what kind of level you're looking at. So we looked at both are probably useful from a management point of view. And then we did some estimates around exactly how much. We estimated around 3,000 tons of nitrogen could be removed in the solent, 600 odd tons of phosphorus, and around 20,000 tons of carbon. We then want to put some kind of economic value in that. So for nitrogen and phosphorus, we use replacement costs, which were based on catchment sensitive approaches, payments for ecosystem services, and upgrades to water treatment plants. And we came up with a range of values between 5 and 1,100 pounds to remove an equivalent of nitrogen and phosphorus as opposed to building built infrastructure. So how much it would cost to replace these services if we didn't have them, essentially. And for carbon, there's various ways to value carbon, but we used an abatement cost method, which is recommended by the UK government. The value ranges between 30 and 90 pounds per kilo of carbon, tons of carbon, sorry, and we used the average value around 60 pounds. And in total, we estimate, if you combined all, that the solent removes around £1.1 billion worth of nutrients and carbon from the surrounding environment, which is quite a big number. If you put that in context with some of the other services that are ongoing in the solent, such as tourism and recreation, which is worth roughly around 4 million, commercial fisheries are worth around 14 million. So this is an important finding because regulating services are very rarely valued. So it's worth thinking about them in terms of natural capital assessments. The next step, we want to look at adding condition. Does that affect any of the valuations? So we came up with the idea of using WFD indications of ecological status because they're ground truthed, and just one way of looking at how condition can be integrated in natural capital assessments. We then looked across each of the estuaries. So each estuary has a classification between poor and high, which we could then use to modify the values that we already had. And this is just a summary table showing you how the different estuaries compared for each of the different habitats. So Leamington Estuary, for example, for littoral sediments was high, whereas native oysters in the Solent Channel were bad. So it's just changing some of the values we had from the initial assessments by integrating condition. And if we add in condition, we estimated that there was an extra around 300 odd tons of nitrogen removed. And across the board, integrating condition into our assessments actually improved our estimates of ecosystem services by around 11 to 67%, which could mean that in the solent's case, we are actually undervaluing these different services. Okay, many of the different habitats were actually in moderate and unfavorable condition. So the next thing we wanted to do was to look at various restoration programs around the solent. Currently, there's a huge process of restoring native oysters in the solent. Currently, nowhere in the solent has greater than 1 oyster per metre squared, but there's currently a lot of restoration efforts to add tens of thousands of oysters over the next 5 to 10 years. There's also other ongoing restoration actions, such as to restore seagrass and salt marsh. So we wanted to do some calculations to see how these restoration or nature-based solutions might, how they might affect the services that we've looked at. So this is just putting into context the different scenarios. We had one scenario around creating new habitats. So what happens if we create a new salt marsh? What happens if we actually improve the condition of habitats? And then a best case scenario, what happens if we created habitats and improve the condition of various habitats? So this is just a summary. So scenario 1, if we actually created new habitats, we estimate the benefits would be around 388 million. If we transitioned all habitats to good conditions, we have around 376 million. But the biggest actual jump was if we transitioned all habitats in the solent to high conditions, there would be a jump to around 830 million in regulating service benefits. And of course, the greatest value would be combining the creation of new habitats and getting existing habitats to high condition at around £1.2 billion of additional savings. And this again is all published. If you're interested, you can go check it out. So overall take-home messages, not including condition in natural capital assessments could, at least in the solent's case, lead to under or overvaluation of ecosystem services. In the solent, it could lead to undervaluation, but that's not to say in other places around the UK there could be an overvaluation if you don't add condition, and this could lead to a risk of poor business decisions or failed restoration attempts. And we need to better understand the health of the ecosystem services in question. We've shown that nature-based solutions can bring large and yet uncalculated benefits in timeframes relevant for the Water Framework Directive, but it's also important to recognise that there's large degrees of uncertainty around not just the values that we've presented here, but also the biophysical estimates and also the habitat mapping estimates. So there's still quite a lot of work to be done. And just to say, we are going back to the solent to address some of these uncertainties. We have a new project called See the Value, which is led by Professor Nicola Beaumont at Plymouth Marine Lab. And this time we're going back to take some actual field measurements around native oysters and all the other different habitats and see if we can better link them onto different green investment options. So that's it. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I hope other people have questions because I definitely have a couple, and it's ideally not just me that's talking at the end. Do chuck them in the Slido, but first we're going to move on and hear from Hannah.
Okay, excellent. Well, hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming along today for the talk. I'm really pleased to be able to speak with you and share what natural capital means to the fishing industry and how we interact with the concept on a day-to-day basis, and also what it means for fisheries management. So I'm Hannah Fennel and I'm the head of Orkney Fisheries Association, and I'm also the vice president of Scottish Fishermen's Federation. And these organisations, they act essentially as like a trade union for the fishing industry. So we advocate for the needs of the fishing industry and the people and the families which work within it. So on a day-to-day basis, my work's largely centred around the advocacy role. So trying to fight for better improvements to pier-side infrastructure in rural and island communities, helping fishers get the safety training that they need, and most recently kind of helping businesses navigate the inflation and also the red tape as a result of Brexit. But as well as that, a lot of my work deals with the concept of natural capital, particularly when it comes to fisheries management and also marine management, so marine protected areas and highly protected marine areas. So today I was going to speak to you about kind of what natural capital is, how we can account for it in our decision making, and also how the idea of natural capital can either strengthen or potentially undermine the successful management of industries such as fishing. So natural capital, you probably all already know this, but it includes certain stocks of elements in nature that have value to society. So things like forests, fisheries, rivers, biodiversity, land and minerals. And so it's including both the living and non-living aspects of ecosystems. So put more simply, it's kind of this stock of renewable, non-renewable resources on Earth, and these can combine to yield a flow of benefits or services to people. And these ecosystem services include things like providing goods for food, so things like fish, water, fuel, lumber, and they can also regulate environmental conditions as well. So like Stephen was talking about, things like controlling pollution, protecting against floods or forest fires, purifying water. And they can also support recreational, like cultural practices, so recreation, spiritual fulfillment, just aesthetic enjoyment. And the benefits that we get from this natural capital occurs across scales. So we can get them on a really large national scale or kind of more locally as well. And the concept of natural capital really, I think, helps us take a step back from a more traditional kind of rigid economic approach to value, and it gives us a bit more of a nuanced approach to value. But I think incorporating this approach into systems which have traditionally relied really largely on economic values to make decisions has been quite difficult. So while we've got now these processes and methods for compiling natural capital and understanding what it is, trying to get that understanding into public sector decision making is still quite difficult. So what does this mean for fisheries? I think the fishing industry is a really good industry to consider when talking about natural capital and ecosystem services. The UK fishing industry is made up of over 2,800 boats, the majority of which are under 10 metres in length, which we know as the inshore fleet. So they'll fish generally no more than 3 miles away from shore. And 66% of the boats in the UK use static or passive fishing gear. So they're things like your pots and traps for lobsters, or sometimes, as they're known up here, called creels as well. And fishing, it's very nuanced. It's not really a job. It's more of a vocation and an identity, and it's one that's intrinsically linked with the natural environment. And unlike a lot of other extractive industries, the success of the fishing industry really requires healthy ecosystems and healthy environments. So the idea of natural capital and benefiting from the sum of the parts has existed as a concept in fisheries management for a number of years. So if we're looking at from a purely economic point of view, fish stocks can be considered as natural assets or capital stocks, and they provide harvestable fish. So if you've got stock sizes that are relatively low, going fishing means borrowing from this natural capital stock. And since reduced fish grow more slowly, this can in turn make future catches smaller and will increase the fishing costs as well. And traditionally, fisheries management has been focused on fish stocks in isolation. And gradually over time, it became accepted that fisheries is only ever going to be successful if the ecosystems in which they operate are successful as well. So this understanding gave rise to the concept of ecosystem-based management, which is where the end goal is not just sustainable and healthy fish stocks, but it's sustainable fisheries and resilient and productive ecosystems. So for fisheries, ICES is the main driver of ecosystem assessments, and this is what we use to make fisheries management decisions. So ICES works to create ecosystem assessments for different ecoregions, which is what you can see on the map here. And there's three main outputs that, or three main things that are needed to support these ecosystem-based management. You need advice on fishing opportunities, fisheries overviews, and also ecosystem overviews as well. And these need to be continually developed to address new information and changes that are happening with the ecosystem or with legislation or with the drivers of fisheries as well. So spatial management and regional priorities all get addressed as part of the advice in these ecoregions. The ecosystem overviews use qualitative methods to identify and focus on the top 5 priority human activities and fishing pressures that end up being managed within each ecoregion. And this means they put fishing activities into the context of the trends and the status of the marine ecosystem as a whole. So in recent years, these methods have been used to assess the status of information limited stocks, to look at the impact of types of fishing gear on the seabed, and to look at things like potential cetacean bycatch in fishing gear as well. And I think this idea of having a holistic approach that encompasses living and non-living factors into our decision making is becoming more and more important, especially due to things like climate change. So climate change, as we all know, it's really disrupting all our natural resources and the ecosystem services that we get from them. And it's accelerating the depletion of our natural capital. In fishing, this is, as you can imagine, incredibly bad. There's been studies that have found or suggested that between the years 1930 and 2010, that the maximum sustainable global yield of seafood fell by 4% as a result of warming oceans. So in fishing, we really need to make sure that our management is flexible and it's adaptive enough to account for these shifts. And it needs to be able to do this not only on large global scales, but also on small enough scales that is meaningful so we can actually account for it in our management. So as I said before, I'm based in the Orkney Islands, which are these little red islands here on the map. And our fishery is made up of 110 boats. Most of them are small inshore boats under 10 meters in length. They're fishing for things like crab, lobster, and scallops. Our islands support 2 crab processors, which supply Marks and Spencers and Waitrose, and as well as several wholesalers that sell our product to the UK, Europe, and also even Asia. The fishers in Orkney, like fishers everywhere, they're incredibly in tune to the natural environment, and they've got a huge amount of knowledge, not just about the species that they're catching, but also the tides, the currents, the movements and behaviours of other species in the seas. And for a number of years, Orkney Fisheries Association, we've really been trying to look at how we can enshrine this knowledge into more formal management processes. And this is particularly important for the inshore fisheries because there's a huge paucity of data for inshore commercial stocks throughout the UK and even globally. And this is really challenging for us when we're trying to manage our fisheries. And these uncertainties and change environmental parameters that are associated with climate change are really exacerbating that issue. So in Orkney, what we're doing, we're trying to find new ways to collect environmental data along with fishing data so we can understand, mitigate, and hopefully adapt to these changing environmental conditions to try and future-proof the industry and the fishery, but also the communities which rely on us. And one way that we're doing this is by trialing this new technology. So it's this device here. It's from a UK company, Safety Net Technology. And the small device, it gets fitted within a creel or a pot, and it takes measures of environmental data, so salinity, light, temperature, turbidity, things like that. It's in still quite an early stage, this technology, so there's a few issues you need to iron out, especially in terms of battery life. But we're really hoping that by equipping these into Orkney's fishing fleet, we're going to be able to collect a huge amount of fine-grained environmental data that we can use alongside catching data to identify really important patterns and trends. And we want to start using this data to create a baseline, an environmental baseline for Orkney. And that can be used not just for fisheries projects as well, but can be used for natural capital assessments and the local marine regional plan. Aside from fisheries management, another way that fisheries is interacting with the concept of natural capital is when it comes to conservation. So things like marine protected areas and highly protected marine areas. Both the UK and the Scottish Government, they've committed to introducing HPMAs, and the Scottish Government has said they're going to introduce HPMAs in 10% of inshore and offshore waters in Scotland by 2026. We're still waiting for a lot of these details and what this really means and what the selection criteria is going to be for these. But the aim is to allow for the protection and the recovery of marine ecosystems and to try and halt this biodiversity loss that we're seeing at the moment, and to try and help mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So the designation and management of HPMAs is probably going to take an ecosystem-based approach and protecting all marine biodiversity and ecosystem services within the boundary of the HPMA from damaging levels of human activities. And I think HPMAs, they have a huge potential to help us safeguard important ecosystems and habitats and improve the overall resilience of ecosystems and benefit commercial fish stocks as well. But there's also obviously a concern from a fisheries perspective here as well. Obviously, as an industry, we need to have really healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, but the small scale nature of the inshore fisheries means that you've got a very limited resilience to blanket management measures, and it can be very difficult to adapt. So there's these really interesting tensions about the trade-offs between different ecosystem services and the benefits that are going to happen when we talk about marine protected areas or HPMAs. So it's leading to this really important question of how do we compare different services, and how can we or should we trade off one service, for example, aesthetic enjoyment, for another, such as local employment? And is there a way to balance these two? Who gets to make these decisions, and who gets to decide one service is more important than another, and weighing up the local needs to kind of national and global contexts as well? And I don't think there's any easy answer to these questions, but they are important questions to ask. I think the concept of natural capital is really a foundation in how we're talking about resource management and conservation. But we also need to be aware that the management and the conservation, it's occurring in a social system as well as an ecological one. And we can't ignore social dynamics such as rural deprivation and class. So choosing aesthetic value of an ecosystem over the livelihoods within an area, provided they are sustainably done without a proper and thorough discussion and consultation, it risks disenfranchisement, and it can exacerbate existing social issues as well. And ultimately can prioritise some of the ways of interacting with the environment over others. And I think these conversations, they're going to evolve over the years, and the concept of natural capital is going to become more and more entrenched in the decision-making process. And we've got to remember that, like we use natural capital to explore the nuances and interconnectedness of our environment and ecosystems, we also need to consider the dynamics and the complexities of our social and cultural systems as well, and to consider different ways of knowing and interacting with the environment as well. So I'm going to kind of end there on that slightly philosophical point and say thank you very much for coming along and listening to me today. And I'm also happy to answer any questions. I put my email in the slide there, so I'm also happy for anyone to email me at some point if they've got any follow-up questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting, and particularly thanks for talking about some of those social considerations and the trade-offs that we have to think about and that we have to think very carefully about. I think that's a really important part of the discussion. So we'll move on to a couple of questions now. If we've got a couple in the Slido, participants, you can also put your hands up if you'd like to speak directly. That's also fine. But the first question we've got is for you, Stephen, and it's a question about how you link condition to ecosystem service delivery. Lauren has posed this question as it's very relevant to a project that we're working on next year.
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of different ways you can link condition to ecosystem service and natural capital assessments. The way we chose to do it was using the Water Framework Directive ecological status indicators, which go from poor to high. By using this kind of 5-point scale, we could then link that onto kind of the calculations we'd done for the biophysical rates. So our reference condition would have been moderate condition if you aligned it with the WFD classification. Similarly, if it was poor, that would be related to the minimal provision for the ecosystem service. And if it was high, that would have been related to the maximum provision for that service. There's lots of different ways you could do it, but that's the way we did it. And we have published that. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send the paper.
All right, thanks. It's a really interesting paper. Okay, we also have a question for you, Stephen, about somebody's asked if the project was able to add value to the salt marsh habitat alone.
Yeah, so we did look at just salt marsh individually, and we looked at that at a regional context and also at the scale of the whole of the Solent. So we did value that for nutrients, phosphorus and carbon. It was actually, if you take it at a regional level, salt marsh was actually one of the most important habitats, particularly for carbon. So we did suggest that using salt marsh in particular would be a great habitat for nature-based solutions, because it was one of the better providers per area in uptaking various nutrients and carbon. So it's important, but also if you extrapolated it out as well, mudflats were also quite important. So it depends on what scale you're looking at, but we do have values for salt marsh. We did value them. Yeah.
Okay, and I suppose related to that question is about whether you've been able to look at how service provision might change over time. For example, if condition improves and the inflow of nutrients decreases.
Yes, so we did do some scenarios around what would happen if we increased and decreased condition. I didn't show the scenarios for decreasing condition, but we did. That was in the report as well. So we did estimates about if you reduce nutrients and improve the condition of the habitats, what would that do to the value? So we did do that, and there was substantial increases in the services as you reduce the nutrients. Equally, you could see as it goes towards poorer conditions that there'd be a loss in the different ecosystem services. But that's provisional, of course, on various different factors. Things can change when you're doing scenario analysis. Yeah. So there's a lot of caveats around that. Yeah, we did do some scenarios.
Yeah, okay, thanks. One for Hannah now, if that's all right. But Lauren's wondering if you've had any thoughts about how you'd start to prioritize the importance of certain ecosystem services and how you make those judgment calls.
I mean, it's definitely something I've had loads of thoughts about, but I've not come up with any solutions or strategies. I think for me, when I'm having these conversations with people, I think the important thing is just try and find a way that we can marry these ecological components with the sociocultural ones as well. So I say there's a huge overlap between them, and we've got to be really mindful of that when we're trying to make these decisions. And I think trying to do so on kind of a more localized basis to really allow for the nuances of the ecosystem and the people living within those habitats is going to be really important, while also trying to keep that big picture in mind of where we want to be, to net zero and to try and halt what's happening to our environment in terms of climate change.
And following on from that, really, do you think that the right forums exist to be able to have those conversations at the moment, or are there things we could be doing differently?
I think in terms of things like the highly protected marine areas. I think that's still in really early days, so I'm really hoping there's going to be forums there to have these really complicated conversations. I know within specifically fisheries, there's been a move towards more localized management with like the ecosystem, and in Scotland we've got the inshore fisheries groups. So I think there's potential to have those conversations as well there, but it's really, I think, trying to develop the language around it to understand how to do this is going to be really important, and to get all the stakeholders to understand what it is we're trying to do. I think that'll be the hardest bit.
Yeah. A question from me then, I think, is do you think that natural capital is or natural capital approaches is the right framing and the right language to be able to have these conversations?
I think it is. I think it can just work alongside other, as I say, kind of more ideas on the social side of things as well. But I definitely think there's a huge amount of value in natural capital and how it allows us to work within existing systems that have been very heavily economic focused. So I definitely think there's a huge value in the idea of natural capital.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from Vicky Morgan, who's on the call as well, who's asking you, Hannah, about the diversity of views, or what diversity of views do you encounter to natural capital ideas amongst fishers, and is there, or how much is skepticism, or is there positive interest?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think, speaking from a particularly kind of inshore fishing view, I think that idea of natural capital has been in fishing for many, many years and even generations. I just think the language there to express how people were interacting with the environment didn't quite exist there yet. So I think there is support for it, but as with everything, I think there's a bit of trepidation to see what this ends up meaning for fisheries management. But as a concept, I think it has been in fishing for a number of years, just not under those specific words.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think these concepts have been around a long time, haven't they? And it's just a different way of talking about things. I've got another question for you, Stephen, about your project. And do you know how many other assessments like this have been completed or in the pipeline? I mean, at the JNCC, we're aware of a couple, but would really value your perspective on that.
Yeah, I'm aware of a few. So we were following the work of the Marine Pioneer projects, which some of you might be familiar with. So PML in particular have done quite a lot in North Devon. There's been a big natural capital assessment up there of coastal environments around Suffolk. They again have done a natural capital approach. We've done the Solent now, so they are getting a lot more common. And the Sea the Value project I mentioned, we're returning to the Solent, but we're also going up to the Murray Forth to do a natural capital assessment. So they're getting more and more common. They're just the ones I know about. I'm sure there's plenty of other ones. So yeah.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. For Hannah, do you know if there are any plans for creating baseline natural capital assessments for the HPMAs?
I don't yet, because as I say, it's for Scotland anyway. It's really early days for the HPMA process, and we're still waiting on the consultation, which will be about the selection criteria for the HPMAs. But it is something that I think, well, I know that the fishing industry is going to push for, because at the end of the day, I think having a baseline really helps us understand what's going on and if the HPMAs have been successful. So I do hope so.
Me too.
Yeah.
And for the data that the fishers that you work with collect via SafetyNet, is that going to be open data, and how will it be shared? And then there's a question about whether it will be both catch and environmental data together.
So at this early stage, the data is not going to be open because it's just really trialing the technology and seeing if it worked. As I said, this is the first time we trialed it. We found a lot of issues with things like battery life, which has been an issue. But the hope would be that eventually, once the system's up and running and we can deploy it across the fleet, then this data would be open data, and it would be able to be used for not just fishing, but multiple other things as well. For the catch data, that's a bit more tricky. I think the fishers have to collect their catch data anyway, so we'd probably just try to use the existing catch data collection systems instead of trying to replicate it, just because otherwise it becomes a huge burden for the fishers and would probably have a lot less take up of the technology. But there would be a hope to try and link up the two somehow.
Poppy, you've got your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it was just back to the HPMA point. It's certainly, natural capital is certainly bandied around a lot in the conversations that are being had. Obviously, no decisions have been made yet, but I very much suspect that there will be some effort put into baseline surveys when they are designated or prior to them being designated.
Brilliant.
Hope so, yeah.
Okay, there's one last question on the Slido at the moment, and that's for Stephen, asking, is there a calculation used for the Solent example that could be applied to other areas for quick estimates on things like carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so the carbon rates are a synthesis of carbon rates across various marine habitats. So they are generalized kind of rates that can be applied anywhere else, with caveats, of course, that these are temperate studies. So yeah, the rates that we supply can be applied across the UK. Just for my talk, we probably recommend putting some error bars around them because there's a great deal of variation around the carbon values, especially for things like oysters and stuff. But yeah, they can be applied across the UK.
Okay. One of my questions actually sort of follows on from that in terms of, and I suppose this is a question to both of you as well, but do you have thoughts on how we can best communicate that uncertainty and that nuance in a way that means that it gets included in decision making? I don't mind who jumps in.
I was just going to say, yeah, I feel like including uncertainty into these things is always really hard because I think naturally we always want to have really clear, concrete answers. And I think kind of the best way to deal with that is to have these risk assessments outlining the uncertainty, but also make sure that we're constantly revisiting what we've done and trying to fill in any data gaps or uncertainties we have, and constantly revisiting it and evolving it over time. I think that's really the best we can do.
Yeah, I would agree. Just putting the uncertainties up front. The reason we did such a range of variation was to give a degree of error or uncertainty, I guess. So not just taking the median or average value, showing that there is a range of value and displaying that in a format that decision makers can see. Because a lot of the time we just take averages and say that's the value, but we actually need to be much clearer around the uncertainties around them so that better decisions can be made.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Vicky's just put a note in the chat as well about the natural capital baseline assessments for HPMAs. She says that in England, I believe that the evaluation framework will cover environmental, social, and economic impacts, including the hope displacement, which will cover most of the basis for natural capital. Okay, thank you. That's useful context. Another question has popped up on the Slido as well about, for Stephen, in your study, what was the most valuable habitat in the Solent?
Depends on if you talk about regionally or overall. If you talk about overall, it was actually mudflats, surprisingly, because generally they take up the largest area, so they actually sequester the most amount of nutrients and carbon. But if you go down to individual like kilometers squared or meters squared, then it was actually salt marsh. So it depends on the scale you're looking at. And it's not just our study, there's been quite a few studies now that have shown that if you look at wide areas, sediments are actually really important. But we often focus in on per square meter, looking at things like salt marsh and stuff. So
yeah, it's a really interesting one. And Lauren's followed on with that about whether you have any thoughts on how to communicate the different findings that you have at different scales. When you were speaking to people, how did you get that across?
Breaking it down between regional graphs and overall graphs is how we got around it. We found that depending on who we spoke to, if it was catchment managers, they were generally more interested in the regional stuff. But if we were speaking to scientists in general, they were much more interested in overall. So it was just breaking down the data in different ways, I guess. so that different people could see it. We also did infographics and things, so we could promote it to our general audience. So we tried to do different approaches to how we kind of conveyed the data.
Okay. Hannah, I was wondering if because your work is very place-based, or what you've talked about today is very place-based, I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate a little bit on some of the trade-offs between how we prioritize different ecosystem services and what that means in your specific context.
Yeah, I think when for the fishing industry, when we're talking about the trade-off between the ecosystem services, it kind of comes down to that the economic or the livelihood aspect compared with the more recreational or aesthetic values as well, which can be really, really hard. It's really interesting as well, because I think with fishing, obviously it is primarily an economic activity, but you have all these other values associated with it as well. Like I say, it's an identity, it's a huge cultural component too. So it's in itself, it's not just an economic activity. I don't think people really are fishing now for the economics of it. They'd be doing something else if they were. But there's a lot, not just in Orkney, but on the west coast of Scotland as well. There's this really interesting tension really between those who have grown up in that area and work in fishing or aquaculture, and those that have moved there later in life and have gone there and they prize the views and the pristine environment. And it's how do you weigh up what these two groups of people want, because they both live there now, but they both have very different links and ties to the environment and different ways of viewing and interacting with it. And so they're the kind of the main trade-offs and the tensions there. And you can imagine it'd be very hard if you've lived your whole life in this one area doing your job, and then someone comes along and says, well, you can't do it anymore because it's a bit of an eyesore. And so that's the main conversation we have within the industry at the moment when we're talking about trade-offs.
That's really interesting. That's a tension that I'm sure plays out in lots of coastal communities. All right. Does anybody have any questions that they want to raise directly, or any last minute ones for the Slido while we're here?
Can I just ask back to the creel devices that you've got? What's the timeline? What is for your kind of trial period?
So they're actually, I'm looking at one in the corner of my office now, because they actually came off the boats today, just because the weather's now so bad in Orkney that there's no point in deploying them, because the battery won't last in this sort of temperature that we're dealing with. So I think what they're going to do now is the company Safety Net Technologies, they're going to go back to the drawing board over the next few months and try and deal with some of the issues. So improving the battery life and trying to insulate the device a bit better, because we've interestingly found that the pots with the device in it catch a lot less lobsters than the ones without. So we feel like the lobsters are very sensitive to the electronics going on in there. So I imagine they'll be trying again in summer to deploy the device again and to see if it works better that time. So I think we're still, I don't know, at least 5 years away from being able to have it across a lot of boats in the fleet in Orkney, but hopefully a bit sooner.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Anybody else before we wrap up? We've got about 10 minutes if anyone's got any burning questions. Oh, I can see a hand. Vicky.
Yeah, it's not a burning question, but I was curious while you were talking, Hannah, about how this how your research and the outcomes and the sort of discussions, how that fits with other industries, particularly thinking about aquaculture and other, the types of sort of marine businesses, how, if you think it'll sort of change things or links in with other things. Sorry, that's quite an inarticulate question. I hope you got the gist of it.
But do you mean, sorry, in terms of like those playoffs, really?
Yes, so either the data you get or the actual people that are involved, if they're, you know, if they're completely separate from aquaculture sort of businesses, or if there's a kind of business community where your sorts of data and information might make a difference to other people as well.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we'd just be really keen to ultimately use the data to try and support the natural environment within Orkney, and that would obviously have a number of different beneficiaries, and the aquaculture would be one of them, and as well as tourism and recreation too. So it's ultimately, at the end of the day, for us, collecting this data is really about understanding the environment, mainly with regards to understanding what we need to do to climate proof it. So I think we'd definitely be willing to work with other businesses and people within Orkney to try and help do this. And I'm sure that they have their own data sets as well, especially with the aquaculture side. That would be really useful to sort of sense check what we're collecting on our grounds. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks. That's very interesting.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you both very much for coming. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that, and it was a very complimentary set of case studies, I thought, for talking about marine natural capital. So just thank you on behalf of all of us as well. Learned a lot today. So I'll wrap up now, and we can stop the recording. But for people who are interested, the second session in this series is going to be on finance and economic case studies, and will run on Tuesday, the 22nd of November from 3 till 4. And we have two speakers again, and they will be Dr. Catherine Simpson from the University of Stirling and Natalia Kharadi from FTech. So that's coming up next week. So if anybody else would like to join in that and they haven't had the meeting link yet, then please do let me know, and I'll make sure you get that. And yeah, thanks again. That was brilliant.